All right, so we'll start with setting our motivation. We'll use refuge in bodhicitta. Sangye chunon sogi chunam lai janchu paru dani kapsuchi dagi chunyan gi pe sonam gi drola penchya sangye drupa sho sangye chudon sogi chunam lai janchu paru dani kapsuchi Dagi chunyan gi pe sonam gi drola benjir sange drupa sho sange chodon sogi chunam lai jantu padu dani kapsuchi Dagi chunyan gi pe sonam gi drola benjir sange drupa sho. Just letting that motivation connect. Okay. So this is our last session, and I think that for this session, we'll do the meditation related to the content last time. So we were really looking at the perfection of patience. And once we kind of wrap up patience, then we'll pivot and jump straight to wisdom at the almost end. The very last chapter is the dedication verse. And if you have time, I really recommend reading the whole dedication verse. It's so beautiful, it's so poetic, and really has all of our aspirations that we think about all the time framed in such a beautiful way. But we won't have time to do it this time. So let's go ahead and start with our meditation. And we'll do an analytical meditation on patience as an antidote to anger, using some of the verses from Guide to a Bodhisattva's Way of Life. So just start by getting yourself a posture that feels stable, particularly stability with your back. And settle into that posture, scanning along your spinal column up and down, imagining it comes into perfect alignment like a stack of coins. Your chin slightly tucked. And just be in the body, allowing it to come into balance. And then when it feels like your body is settling, shift to a single pointed focus, the mind itself, or the breath, which is ever most comfortable. And just settle your mind in single pointedness to allow surface distractions to settle. Mind or breath. Simple, direct. then invite in some thoughts about your motivation in your own words to yourself. The reason I'm meditating on patience is in order to develop my mind to its fullest potential, in order to benefit all sentient beings. Framing that in whatever way resonates for you. Articulating it in your own words to yourself. And so getting us into the right vibration for patience, we think of these verses from Guarding Introspection, chapter 5, that unruly sentient beings are like space. All of them cannot possibly be overcome. But if I overcome the mind of anger alone, this will be equivalent to vanquishing all foes. Where could I possibly find enough leather with which to cover the surface of the earth? Having leather just on the soles of my shoes is equivalent to covering the earth with it. Likewise, it is not possible for me to counteract things externally. But should I counteract this mind of mine, what is the need for counteracting others? So just letting your own experience and logic unpack that. Where does the power lie? Externally or internally? Maybe both, but what percentage? No anger inside, no enemy outside. And so we resolve that whatever befalls me, I shall not disturb my mental joy. Having been made unhappy, I shall not accomplish what I wish for, and all my virtues will decline. Why be unhappy about something if it can be remedied? And what use is there being unhappy about something if it cannot be remedied? Settling the mind with that wisdom that we've already observed in our life so many times but forget. And then thinking there is nothing whatsoever that is not made easier through acquaintance. So through becoming acquainted with small harms, I will become patient with great harms. It's thinking that simple adage that practice makes perfect. We can work up to it, whatever the challenges in our life. And then, furthermore, suffering has good qualities. Through being disheartened with it, arrogance is dispelled. Compassion arises for those in cyclic existence. Negativities are shunned, and joy is found in virtue. So, even shifting that resistance to suffering, whether it mental or physical or both, circumstantial or relational, all these sufferings do have a good quality. There's the good quality of spurring you on to liberation. This is because if you had no suffering, you wouldn't develop determination to be free, renunciation, the wish of definite emergence. If everything's fine, you forget to practice. Just reflecting on if that's true for you. Feels like when things open up, when things become more relaxed, when life is easier, then we'll practice. But when those moments come, often we get lost in them. But a bit of suffering acts like a mindfulness bell. We become more alert, more strategic, come back to the path or deepen it. Just reflecting if that's been true for you. And suffering has the good quality of dispelling arrogance. Because when suffering strikes you, it reduces your sense of superiority. It can knock you down a peg in a good way. Help you relate to those who struggle. Finding examples in your life when this might have been true. Suffering can be sobering. And suffering has the good quality of causing you to shun destructive actions. Because when you experience very painful feelings, you know they arise from non-virtue. So if you do not want these effects, you must avoid their causes. It reminds you of what destructive actions lead to. It reminds you of the harm to your own self that your own negative minds create. It has the good quality of causing you to like cultivating virtue or positive actions. This is because when you're tormented with suffering, you desire happiness. And once you want it, you must cultivate the virtue that causes it. So whether good or bad, suffering reminds you of karma, which reminds you of ethics. And suffering has the good quality of producing compassion for those who wander in cyclic existence, samsara. This is because after you've assessed your own situation, you think, other beings suffer like this. Something relational in compassion. Something that needs a perspective that's similar enough to have affinity for. Having suffered, you don't want others to suffer. Having suffered, you don't want others to create the causes for suffering. Having suffered, you understand what suffering does. So thinking of these five and what they indicate, you can think of other good qualities of suffering. And you train your mind to think, this suffering is a condition I want. Like a bodybuilder who likes to feel the burn of exercise. That these very things I once pushed away and had resistance to, now I know make me stronger, more mindful, more compassionate, humble. Shantideva says, some, when they see their own blood, become especially brave and steady. But some, when they see the blood of others, become unconscious and faint. These come from the states of the mind, being either steady or timid. Therefore, I should disregard harms and be unaffected by suffering. So we can shift and decide to not let it sway us. As the Buddha said in the Array of Stock Sutra, daughter, in order to destroy all afflictions, you should develop a mind that is hard to defeat. Thus, you need courage that is very firm and stable. You will not be able to accept suffering with a fragile mind. If you initially develop a significant degree of courage, even great suffering becomes helpful. It is just like the case of warriors entering a battle and using the sight of their own blood to increase their boldness. So just let yourself stabilize on the very fuel for impatience and anger is usually suffering. But that same fuel could be fuel for compassion, for courage, for ethics, for renunciation. If you decide to make the suffering voluntary, if you decide it's what you want, not chasing it, not masochistic, but whatever comes and ripens, deciding it's useful. What in your life that is difficult, that you do not want, can you adopt this attitude towards and decide this is the perfect thing? This is just what my practice needs. Through all the energy we put into this analysis, may we develop the perfection of patience and all of our qualities to their utmost extent in order to become enlightened for the benefit of all sentient beings. So, of the three types of suffering, there is suffering when harmed by others or forbearance with people. There's patience when we're suffering, managing physical and mental pain. And there's patience of keeping concentration or certitude of the Dharma. We did the one related to suffering specifically. Of course, the others can play into it. But the idea is that you're not chasing suffering or hunting for suffering, right? You're realizing that suffering at our level is an inevitable part of life. And if you change the way you think about it radically, without like gaslighting yourself, without spiritual bypassing, without getting like rose-colored glasses and weird about it, but just really genuine about it will fundamentally change your life. You know, if you decide, all right, I've got this headache. I want this headache. You know, I have this knee pain. I want this knee pain. Oh, I'm in debt. I want this debt. You know, it sounds ridiculous, yeah. But, you know, if you really think about it, it actually becomes this very interesting investigation into what has actually helped me develop. What has actually been useful in my life for the very qualities I feel so, you know, proud of in a good way, like in a confident way. They were born from hardship. The things that you treasure about yourself, your kindness, your compassion, your patience, your resilience, whatever it is, was born from a struggle, and so then we forget when we're in a new struggle that this is going to be quite helpful in a bit, because it doesn't feel particularly helpful right now. So this is what I want. This is what I want. How can I use it? This is a very it's a nuanced inner conversation, because if you get too simplistic, then you get weird. Yeah, and I'm sure we've all kind of skipped ahead or jumped over the present moment experience to what we know we're supposed to think if we're good Dharma students, without living in the land of first, I didn't want this to happen. You need to first land in that place of, I didn't want this. Now, what am I going to do with it? Then the reframe. We jump over that step often, and we're like, oh, I'm supposed to reframe. I'll reframe. I'll reframe, and it doesn't work if you skip the step of, oh, well, that was unfortunate. You have to really be there. Yeah. And can you think of times when you talked yourself out of what you were feeling and then it came around and bit you? Yeah, you pretended that you weren't feeling what you were feeling. Yeah, and you mind trained yourself so thoroughly that you skipped the fact that your heart was still hurting. And now there's a little bit of a blockage or a gap or a hole or just something like unresolved, something unsettled. So don't skip the step of being honest with yourself to say, whether logical or illogical, I did not want this, whatever this is, to happen. Yeah. And that is the very thing that I want. Yeah. Does that make sense? Yeah. So, you'll see it in all religious traditions, or all spiritual traditions, probably all philosophical traditions, and of course, Buddhism is all of those. So, where there's people who have beautiful ideas, just beautiful, remarkable, transformative ideas, and because they intellectually understand it, they think they're already there. Yeah. And then they're disappointed in themselves for still having a struggle because intellectually they know better and they've known better for ages and they can articulate it perfectly. And then why such angst? Why such melancholy? And it's because you have to be real with yourself in that little desert of pain for a little bit. But what you notice when you practice patience a lot, especially when it's low stakes, when it's not a big deal, but you train yourself to not get upregulated or upset or agitated with like the ordinary inconveniences of life, is that you do build a type of strength, and when you build that type of strength, when things get harder, you meet them differently. You meet them with an objectivity that can feel what you're feeling, but hasn't identified with what you're feeling, and you have that kind of dual perspective of, this is going to be useful. I need to not give in to negative states of mind. And also, this is quite painful, and I need to be gentle with myself and make sure I'm doing the basic things like eating well and sleeping well and moving enough. Those basic things are going to keep being true for quite some time. Don't forget that. And also, this is so useful. This will help me have affinity for sentient beings, etc., etc. Yeah. Can you guys think of examples when it's worked well or examples when it has not worked well? Yeah, when there's been suffering and you've done some sort of like deep spiritual conversation with yourself and it was successful, or when it wasn't. How'd you go with the pandemic, for example? Right? Like, when things were inconvenient and the atmosphere was anxious. You may or may not have also been anxious, but it was inconvenient. Yes, we can agree. It was inconvenient. And some of us decided to use that inconvenience to pivot to really have some interesting things happen during that time span. And some of us resisted and were annoyed the whole time and were just fighting against circumstance. Yeah, Brenda, go ahead. Oh, unmute.
Yeah, I live in a very remote place. So for me, it was absolutely blissful. And I was very, very sorry about all the terrible things that were happening everywhere else. But for me, selfishly, I was so happy.
Right.
Uh, and there was, I would go out once or twice a month to do my shopping. And it was so easy, no traffic, no hassle. Wonderful. But I'm not a Pollyanna. I was aware that there was a lot of suffering around. Not around me, fortunately. I was very, very fortunate in that sense, but in the world, and people, yes, many, many people that I knew actually died with COVID or because of COVID, and yeah, that was tough to deal with. But that I think that peace and that space and that time were helpful to deal with the death of people that I really cared about. And
Mm.
there were lots of them. It was just coming one after the other for about a year. So yeah, a balance there, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is tricky, isn't it? Like we have that experience now, don't we, where we're mostly all in relatively safe countries, but we know there's a war in the Middle East and we know there's a war in Ukraine, and whatever our view of those wars are, probably none of us are a fan of war. Whoever we think is the bad guy, whoever we think is the good guy, we're like, trouble is happening, and we know innocent civilians are being killed all over the place, but it's not happening to us. And our governments may or may not have a relationship to adding to that suffering. I'm American, you do the math. But it's one of these things where you're like, all right, so what is my relationship to observing suffering? That's a whole other one, isn't it? And there's a whole school of thought that, if you're not angry, you're not paying attention, or if you're not distressed when you see the news, you must be hard-hearted. And from a Buddhist perspective, those are understandable reactions, but not what we seek, you know? And so what we're wanting is to be at more stable than usual, not less stable than usual, so that we have creativity accessible to us. And to say, I absolutely can name a wrong to be a wrong, or see the pain of others and have it touch me. But having it touch me isn't the same as sucking me under together with it. And I think this can really be a delicate balance, because we usually go too far either way, where we're just sucked into the suffering that we see on the news, or we're a little bit dissociated or, too distant from it. And we're like, oh, that's really sad, but it doesn't touch you at all, And so, how to let it touch you just the right amount, where you're feeling it, you're engaged, but you're not sucked under, because a lot of meditations in Buddhism are actively seek observation of suffering. Think about this kind and this kind and this kind and this kind, like, and if you can't think of any of those, let's think of the animal realms, and let's think of the hungry ghost realms, and let's think of the hell realms, and those are all happening all the time, horribly. Think about it on purpose. Do you think the Buddha wanted you to get distressed, and like go into the vortex of doom and just kind of curl up in a ball and cry? Of course not. It was to make you go, this is the result of allowing negative states of mind to get on a roll. This is the result of the very anger I have now if it were to escalate. This is the result. I cannot allow this habit of mine to continue. I cannot. My little impatience in traffic, my frustration at my neighbors is the tiny grain that leads to war. It's the same thing, it's just on a continuum. And so thinking that you're radically different than warmongers is untrue. You've just had the conditions around you to not allow a certain flourishing of negativity, and thank goodness. But if we're thinking right now where things are less agitated, this is my training ground. And when things come that I don't want, thank goodness, because they're building my strength in a gradual way, relatively speaking. Because if suddenly a bomb dropped on our head and our living situation was chaos, what inner resilience could we count on? People are talking in Oregon, where I live, there's a lot of people who are unhoused, and they often seem mentally ill. And I want to say they may have a mental illness, or they might just be really cold and hungry. Like, how are you just a couple days with bad sleep, chilled and kind of hungry, or eating crap sort of preservative food for many days? Like, how well is your mental state? Do you have a mental illness, or are you just chilled? So it's interesting to kind of look at 2 degrees less comfortable than we are right now. How stable is your mind? 5 degrees less comfortable, how stable is your mind? So framing it that way, then you really do see those incidental hardships and inconveniences of your everyday life as really fortunate to keep you awake, you know? Because if it was just total peace, we just relax into it. And fair enough, right? Fair enough. But, it's not necessarily the growing years. Yeah, Eleanor, go ahead. Go ahead and unmute, darling.
Oh, thank you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, thank you. Um, um, Speaking of watering the seeds really and changing family issues, they are a plenty.
Yep.
And I had one particular member of the family who's extremely angry
Yeah.
and dealing with their anger, like on the phone, for example. But I keep ringing because I believe that he, somebody needs to know that somebody cares about him,
Yeah.
and listening to the anger. Sometimes it's pretty difficult, but then looking at it, thinking that he's suffering in some way. That the anger is the outward expression of what's going on inside him, and that I didn't used to behave like that. Years ago, it would be, oh, buddy, you, and just put the phone down. Yeah, end of conversation. But it's
Yeah.
been over the years. I've been watching, that growth, that change, and it's a change in him as well. So yeah, the Dharma has been a lifesaver. Yeah.
So much, isn't it? I mean, just being able to
Mm,
hold the space for someone going through it.
yeah.
The
Yeah.
quality of your presence changes, doesn't it? And a lot of it is you've
Mm,
worked with your own anger to the point where you can hold other people's anger differently, and it doesn't agitate you the same way. It'll get to you eventually,
mm,
but your capacity is so much more,
mm,
and I think there's a direct correlation between being able to work with your own anger and not being afraid of other people's anger expressions, or not being
mm,
agitated or swept into their anger expressions. So many of these things that we deal with other people, it's like a good old Carl Jung, whatever triggers you in others says something about yourself, to paraphrase, right?
yeah.
And
Mm,
and I think that it's such a good sign when you meet a similar circumstance that you've met many times in your life, and you're meeting it differently. These things give you real faith that the Dharma has taken hold and fundamentally given you the deepest refuge, the deepest refuge of the Dharma integrating. Yeah. So, the anger of others or the bad behavior of others, it's highlighted as its own type of patience practice. Thanks Shantideva. He was like, all right, we'll do patience with suffering, but okay, let's just do people specific. Yeah. There's suffering, and then there's suffering because of people,
mm,
like we're annoyed that it's hot, we're annoyed that it's cold, but really it's people that get under our skin. Let's do that one. Okay. So, I so much love these verses about patience that Shantideva has, because they just hit the nail on the head. So we did the patience with suffering one. Let's do the patience with people one. This is in the patience chapter, verse 39. These two are really fascinating, and they're also in the Lamrim Chenmo by Lama Tsongkhapa. So Shantideva says, even if it were the nature of the childish to cause harm to others, it would be inappropriate to be angry with them. For this would be like begrudging fire for having the nature to burn. And even if the fault were incidental in sentient beings of definite nature, it would be inappropriate to be angry. For this would be like begrudging space for allowing smoke to rise in it. Okay, so they're not questioning the premise of Anger's arguments. The arguments are basically, this is just how they are, or how could they? This is so unlike them. They're completely opposite reasonings, and we're not even challenging those. We're coming to the conclusion that either way, Anger won't help, right? So in the case of the first one, if bad behavior is an intrinsic characteristic of the person, then they couldn't change if they wanted to. How would anger help? Right? Like being mad at fire for burning you. If it's just their nature, what do you expect? Okay, so what if it isn't their nature? If bad behavior is not an intrinsic characteristic of the person, then they can change if they wanted to. How would anger help support their development? Right? You're so angry at them. How is that going to facilitate their transformation? It'd be like being angry at the sky for allowing smoke to rise in it. It's just temporary. It's not them. So these verses I find really fun because it's not saying, is bad behavior intrinsic to sentient beings or is bad behavior not intrinsic to sentient beings? Can people change or can't people change? It's not even dealing with that question. It's saying in either case, anger won't help. So let that just diffuse the fuel you have for when you're impatient with people being badly behaved. Yeah, are you mad at fire for having the nature to burn? It's just its nature. Are you angry at space or the sky for allowing something temporary like smoke to rise in it? It's going to change. It would be that silly, right? So before we get into the patience pivot to wisdom, does that kind of playful attitude make sense to you? If you think about when you're mad at people, what is the underlying reasoning? How could you? This is not like you. Or this is so like you. How could you? Completely opposite reasonings, right? But it's usually one of the two, isn't it? How could you? This is not like you. Yeah, this is so unlike you. Yeah. Well, then, okay, yeah, they have an anger affliction arising as the result of suffering as the result of anger, or excuse me, as the result of ignorance, right? So you got ignorance. Everyone has innate ignorance. And from innate ignorance, you perform all sorts of negativities, which plant karmic seeds on your mental continuum, which arise as suffering when they meet conditions. And when you're suffering, you're usually badly behaved, though not inevitably. Right? But if you're thinking what drove this bad behavior, it was ignorance and suffering. I should be angry at anything, it would be at ignorance and suffering. Yeah, Isla, go ahead.
So I just wanted to, I guess, clarify something. So if I get really, really angry, I then get really, really sad because I try and harness it and not lash it at people. And if I have to lash it, then I try and do it into the air and not at somebody, because I don't want to hurt them. But yeah, I've obviously lost control of it. But then that migrates into sadness, and then at other times it is just plain outright sadness, and it's just trying to kind of understand that that is seen as anger, isn't it? It's just that you've internalized it, so it becomes this just deep despair of like, oh my god, like how do you kind of connect that to the anger and what we're talking about?
Yeah, it's important distinction because, especially if you're socialized female, it's like you're not allowed to be angry, so it implodes. So, for us, anger, usually is described as cold anger or hot anger, right? Like passive aggressive, aggressive, aggressive anger that's like ice and you shut down and you freeze people out and you give them the silent treatment, or anger where you're boiling rage and you're just spewing out all over the place. But there's a third type, which is basically depression. Yeah, where you're directing the anger towards yourself and actually weaponizing that kind of thinking into yourself, and it's like self-loathing. How could I act this way? How could I say that thing? What is wrong with me? And it's all a symptom of over-identifying something. Yeah, it's all a symptom of thinking that the bad behavior is a characteristic of whoever you're angry at, whether it's them or it's you. And what we're trying to do is to isolate anger itself in any context and say this arising itself is fundamentally problematic wherever it arises, whoever it's arising in. But it's not personal to me that I'm the only one that does this, or personal to them that they're the only one that acts like this. It's that weird thing where as soon as you can universalize, it takes a certain amount of pressure off. So if you feel like you're the only one in a certain dynamic with someone that's really problematic and toxic, and then you find out that your best friend is going through the same thing, it strangely makes you feel better. Strangely. Right? You think, well, now we have double trouble. Shouldn't it be double sadness? But suddenly there's this, oh, I'm not the only one that goes through this. And if you think of like a grief support group and everyone's lost their spouse, seems like the saddest thing on earth. And it's really sad, but you're with a lot of people who have a similar experience, and that resonance makes everyone lighter. And it's a fascinating thing. So the psychology of the patient's chapter is really fascinating because it's asking you to immediately say, I'm not the only one. And when you're really depressed, that feels like an impossible thought. I'm not the only one that feels this way. Or if you think I'm not the only one that feels this way, then you feel even worse. And you're like, oh, no, no, I've made it all about me. I'm even worse. And there's starving children in Africa. And you go through a whole whatever. Do you know? So what you're trying to do is to immediately stretch the mind to widen perspective however you can. Yeah, to think, okay, even the very thought, what is wrong with me? Even the very thought, how could I have done such a thing? There are countless thousands or millions of people in this world having that same exact thought right now with slightly different details and circumstances. You're immediately stretching the mind to, there is a whole community of people filled with self-loathing just like mine in this moment. Or there's a whole community of people having visceral, palpable rage towards people they actually think of as loved ones in this exact moment as me. And thinking that, there's a logic to that. It's probably true, yes? Like there's, however many billion people in the world, very likely there's thousands, if not millions, feeling very similar to how you're feeling right now. And letting your heart kind of expand into connection with them gives you some space for creative thought. For, okay, what's a different way to work with this? What's a different way to work with this? If I really have wisdom connected to this whole experience living itself out, at the other end of it, I'm going to be fundamentally more useful to sentient beings. Yeah, because I'm going to understand a level of the human experience that I didn't understand before. And that understanding of the human experience is another pathway of compassion, is another way I can support my friends and family, is going to inform the quality of my presence when I'm with people. Things that we haven't allowed ourselves to see play out, those are the things that then when we're with friends and family going through similar things, we get agitated and we get too problem-solvy and too fixy helpery, and we can't just hold our seat and just hold the space for them and flood that space with love and listen for opportunities to offer support, or listen for opportunities to reflect their wisdom back to them in an empowering way. But the ability to hold your seat and just bear witness to the moment means you have to have done that by yourself a little bit with something enough similar. Otherwise, you meet their suffering and you're just all agitated wanting to fix it because you don't want them to be in pain. But you're also like really feeling like, oh, I should save them. I should help them. I should save them. I should help them. And you've made it about you. Yeah. The millions of times we've done that. someone else is suffering and we've made it about us because we are not able to save them or help them. And it's fundamentally unuseful, right? It's really, really problematic, and we all do it. And we do it from a place that starts with care. But the trick with all of these is that we have over-identified. Yeah, we've over-identified with the negative state of mind, either in the person or in ourselves. And because of that, we get trapped into solutions that can't work. And a lot of anger is thwarted attachment. So looking at what is attachment and how does it exaggerate the good of something or the possibility of something. And when that good or that possibility of a person or a situation kind of shows itself to be an inflated expectation, then we go into this rage or this sadness. But if we hadn't had this inflated Pollyanna sort of story, then we wouldn't be so disappointed. So attachment is lying, attachment is exaggerating, but it's taking a few correct observations. That's why it's so tricky to get rid of. Right? It's taking, like, say you're attached to a person, it's shining a spotlight on some of their good qualities, their good moments, and good times you've had together that really did happen. You're not, you're not crazy. They really did happen. But you're seeing them in isolation from the rest of the story of them. Yeah, and you're, sort of cherry picking your best bits and building a person out of their best bits that you want them to be. And they never were that, right? So you're saying you're this person that I've cherry picked the good bits from, this one, and they've always been this whole complicated other one. And now you're mad at them because they've like betrayed you, or you're mad at them because they've let you down. But they were always all of those qualities. And you're mad at them for not living up to all the best versions you saw of them in isolation. So expectation, attachment, it's really important to say what I observe is true. I don't have to talk over the top of my observations of what I love about them and appreciate about them. I just need to expand the picture to see. And also, on a bad day, they're a grumpy bugger. Also, on a bad day, they get impatient. Also, on the weekends, they forget to shower as often and they're stinky. Whatever, right? Like, but you're remembering like more of them, not just the bits that are your favorite. Yeah, and then attachment can't get that same momentum. And then when it's not going to get thwarted and turn to anger. Now, the issue is that we also have attachment to ourselves. Even if you have depression, I would say, especially if you have depression, because you're holding yourself up to an impossible standard. So you're constantly disappointing yourself and deflating yourself. And you're holding yourself up to a standard that was achievable in a very specific set of circumstances that cannot be replicated precisely. That perfect day when you were on your game, that's who you really are, as opposed to how you are kind of normally. Yeah. And you think that best version is you. And it's like, no, that best version is showing you what your baseline will be with growth. It will be your baseline eventually. It will be your default eventually. But right now, that's when everything comes together perfectly. Let's look at yourself on a normal day or even a bad day and say, even if I never change, I'm good enough. It's a tricky thing to sit with, but even if I never get any better, whatever that means, you're still worthy of love, right? Like think of the entitlement of a house cat. They do nothing, right? They're not guard dogs, right? They're just lounging around, eating, sleeping, playing, destroying furniture. And we love them so much, right? We love them so much. They're not contributing anything to the household, but we love them so much, right? And then we think, oh, I'm crappy and I'm not worthy of love because I don't do these and these and these things correctly or right or enough. We love cats. They don't do anything. Right? Or your bird chirping in the corner, just pooping and eating and causing noise, and we love it so much. Right? Like it's something about being more honest with yourself of what are the ingredients for love? Really just it's a sentient being. A sentient being is lovable. Yeah, because you want it to have happiness and not suffer. A sentient being has Buddha nature. You have Buddha nature. So all of this is to say that anger, whether it's imploded anger or exploded anger, whichever direction the anger is happening, it's usually riding the wave of the thwarted attachment, which really means a thwarted expectation exaggeration story that was always doomed to fail. The spell was always going to be broken at some point. And when the spell is broken, you're depressed or you're angry. So if you go back a step and ask, what are the stories you tell yourself or about other people, and how can you widen the perspective to understand more about them or about you? And all of that be colored by compassion. You have to color all those observations with such a deep kindness, because it's amazing we do as much as we can, given how confused we are, given how much we're in pain, given how easily we're distracted. It's amazing anyone is ever kind to anyone ever. It's a miracle, right? So give yourself a break, give other people a break. It doesn't mean you don't hold yourself accountable or hold other people accountable, but that's a very different energy than the kind of punitive, punishing energy that we get into when people don't live up to our standards. How does punishing someone make them align themselves into better behavior? If it works in a time-limited way. Yeah, you can beat your kids and make them behave, right? People used to do it all the time. But are they behaving because they now think good behavior is ideal? Or are they behaving because they don't want to get whooped? Right? And as soon as you're out of the room, they're going to keep being naughty. And now they have a grudge and a rage against humanity that will have a ripple effect to others in their life ever after. Right? So you can punish yourself into discipline. Yeah, you can squeeze yourself into submission and behave and perform just the way you want to, but there will be a cost. There will be a hardening of your heart or a rebellion, and you'll kind of go back to how you used to be, maybe even worse so. You'll see this with a lot of Dharma practitioners that go too hard too fast, is that they didn't have a compassionate enough or a wise enough attitude towards the whole variety of behaviors they came in with. And then they backslide. Yeah, they're like, this is too hard. That must mean the Dharma doesn't work, or I'm doomed to failure. One of the two, but stuff this. And then they go into a fully hedonistic extreme, or they go into a deep despair, or pivot back and forth, right? So it's something about just keeping such a compassionate gaze towards yourself and all sentient beings, especially if you're asking any kind of change or growth from yourself and others. If you're asking any kind of change or growth, it has to be so gentle and careful and considered, because the habits we came in with are pretty hardwired, and they're going to need a lot of very delicate untangling. Yeah. So self-awareness with a compassionate gaze has a direct correlation to how patient you are with others. Self-awareness with a harsh gaze just makes you either more defensive or more critical, or both. So you might understand more about people and about life, but then you get jaded and cynical as a result of your observation. Yeah, if you go into it with this really nuanced understanding that people come into their behaviors through countless causes and conditions, it softens you in the right way. So it's a very gentle sort of attitude adjustment, which doesn't necessarily impact the way you are in the world externally, particularly right away, but there's a quality of kind of spaciousness and flexibility that can come in actually quite quickly. Just kind of a more spacious, more flexible version of you, but it's still very much you as you are. And with that extra kind of spaciousness and flexibility, it kind of invites better behavior out of other people too. Yeah, and you'll find your relationships improve. And they may not have gotten particularly better, but you're less triggering to them, which is not to say it's your fault if people are badly behaved. Not at all. People need to be accountable for their own behaviors, but we are a condition for each other, and we can be a better condition for each other. And so that can be something interesting to sit with as well. What thoughts are you having about the patience one? Yeah, Eleanor, go ahead. Oh, unmute. Unmute. There you are.
Thank you. I was having a bit of a laugh to myself because all through my life, I've been a yes person, and a service person, etc. And always a pleaser. And I think in my old age, that's all gone. And now it's like I've got my inhibitions have gone, and I say what I think, and it's been a bit of a shock to the family, but I was just having a bit of a laugh and thinking, it's so much easier. It's so much easier. Yeah,
And it's more
yeah,
honest, isn't it? It's a
yeah,
more honest
yeah,
form of love, right? Because people
yeah.
can kind of feel what's going on with you, and then if you say something different, it's jarring, right? So if you say, "Oh, everything's fine, love, everything's fine," but actually you're like, "Do you know what? Could you do the dishes? You never do the dishes. Could you do the dishes?" They felt that was true, even if you said everything was fine. So you might as well just say
Mm,
the true thing from a less
mm,
agitated place, you know? And
mm,
I think
yeah.
that's why you know, older people can be such a delight, right? Because the filter is gone. Thank goodness. The bloody filter, it never really helped to begin with, but we feel like we
Mm,
have
mm,
to, out of some
mm,
sense of civil politeness, whatever. But how refreshing it is to people who just say what is true. What happens to us is that we only say what is true once we have to. And by that time, we're pissed off,
mm,
right? If you say it
yeah.
sooner, you're less upset, and you can just say the
Mm,
true thing, like, "I could use some help doing the dishes." Not, 5 days later when you've been doing it for the whole family, for a whole holiday adventure, and they're like, "Could you do the dishes?" Right? If you just said it early
mm,
on, it wouldn't have had so much sparks, you know?
mm,
So, I
okay.
mean, the wisdom with age, you've learned your lessons, and my mom says all the time, change is inevitable, growth is optional, right? Change is inevitable, growth is
Mm,
optional. And so you really could get a lot wiser with age, but only if you listen
mm,
to your own lessons, right? It's not inevitable that you'll get wiser with age. Some people become grumpy buggers, right? We've seen it.
yes.
So thank you for not being one of those.
Thank you.
Yeah. Look, this is it's hard stuff, but soon patience really presses how much you need wisdom. And there's something really interesting about how a lot of antidotes to anger will make you more angry if you don't do it at the right time, but wisdom doesn't seem to do that. This is something that Geshe Sangye Trinley, who often comes to New Zealand, he says this a lot. He says, if you're in anger, trying to use reasoning and logic to get yourself out of anger might not work at all, might make it worse. Do it before you're angry, do it after you've settled down. That will help your habits. But in the center of the storm, when you are just looking for reasons to reinforce your rage, don't use the normal antidotes. Use body awareness, use simple things, or use wisdom. And wisdom doesn't seem to be as likely to be co-opted by anger. So the wisdom that we're talking about is the wisdom realizing the emptiness of inherent existence. So let's do a 5-minute break, and we'll do that last section. 5 minutes.